I said very publicly that my goal, working on Baltic affairs at the State Department, was to make sure that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania got out earlier and in a different way than the others, because if that didn't happen, I was terrified that the United States would have insisted that they be treated like everyone else. Had that been true, had the Balts gotten out in December when everyone else did, you wouldn't be in NATO, you wouldn't be in the European Union. And I consider that one of the few positive things I really did was to insist on that we treat it as, that this be treated separately. And while I'm deeply ashamed as an American that we were right after Mongolia and right before Cuba in this list, the fact is that by September 2nd, the United States had restored the exchange of diplomats with these countries. And because I was in Tallinn setting up Baker's visit, I'm proud to say that our embassy in Estonia, this was not true in Latvia or Lithuania because nobody there cared, the United States moved back into the same embassy it had in 1940. Exactly the same building. And I took the view that we wanted to do everything we could to stress the continuity of the relationship. So I got Arto Asmai, the mayor of Tallinn, to agree to give us our building back. Nearly destroyed me by the amount of alcohol he insisted on drinking. But it was, in my view, absolutely critical that all of this be done in a way that stressed how different the relationship was. One of the big scandals, which is important in this story, happened after the March Sąjūdis victory, because the White House in this country was being beaten up now that Landsbergis' party has won, and Lithuania is in a position to appoint a new ambassador to Washington or appoint the existing one as representing Vilnius. Why aren't we doing it? And that led to daily questions at the White House and the State Department as to why the United States wasn't moving. That had a consequence which still dogs our relationship with countries around the world. Kurt Kamen, who was the person I traveled to the Baltics twice with, I told him we'd survived doing it twice, we better not do it a third time. Anyway, Kamen came up with what end of March 1990, with what has come to be known in certain limited circles as the Kamen Doctrine. Why couldn't the United States recognize the Sąjūdis government in Vilnius? Because non-recognition policy would imply that we could. Kamen came up with this, which is now settled American policy and which we've applied elsewhere, that the United States can't recognize a government or more precisely, can't do it unless that government can meet three conditions. The first is that you have to be able to travel to that country without getting a visa from a third country. In other words, as long as you had to get a Soviet visa to get to Vilnius, you couldn't do it. That, of course, led to the famous Al D'Amato threat, the senator from New York, who announced he was going to fly to Poland and walk across the Lithuanian border, which led the New York Post to come up with its best headline in all times. It showed a picture of D'Amato and a picture of Gorbachev looking at each other, and it said, D'Amato to Gorby, I'll kick him in the Baltics. It was a great headline. Anyway, the second criterion was that we could not recognize a government that was not in control of its own borders. Now, the fact is the United States doesn't, historically, has never recognized borders before. We recognize states. Borders are a different thing. The United States recognized the state of Israel when that government didn't control the building it was in, much less any given territory. But because of Lithuania and because of these PR problems, Cabin had to come up with that. And the third was that the implication of it was ultimately that we couldn't be first, that there had to be some international precedent for doing it. In other words, the United States couldn't set the terms of recognition if no one else had. Now, it was then pointed out, of course, that effectively Iceland already had, thanks to Hanna Baldwin. But those were the three things that were held up as why we can't do it. No one was putting an embassy in Vilnius. Therefore, nobody else was doing it, and we weren't going to be first. I mean, there was, especially in the first Bush administration, a profound reluctance to be the first to do anything. I mean, these are deeply cautious men. They didn't want the Soviet Union to fall apart. They didn't want the Balts to get independence because it would create problems. And as someone who, for better or worse, at the end of 90 and through 91 until the end, was supposedly doing Baltic policy, or what passed for Baltic policy, at least at the department, I got in terrible fights with people who did not want to move. I mean,
was there any official position of the department that was formed by?
Well, we tried to. We did several things. First, there is an official statement about non-recognition policy. I tried to get it changed in 90 and 91, but I failed because this was vetoed at the policy planning staff. Non-recognition policy says the United States does not recognize the forceful occupation of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania into the Soviet Union. I wanted to change it to say by the Soviet Union, which is a very different thing. And of course, the seventh floor was not willing to go along. They realized what that was about. The second thing we did was to insist that every paper, briefing paper and whatnot, would make reference to non-recognition policy. That the Baltic countries were different, and non-recognition policy was a way of saying that. And we were very careful of keeping the Balts on one side of a line and everybody else on the other. I mean, no one was going to treat the president of Ukraine the way the president of Lithuania was going to be treated. It simply wasn't going to happen. People didn't do that. Everything collapsed after the Balts got recognition, got exchange of diplomats in September. But before that, there was nothing, and not for the Armenians and not for the Ukrainians, the two groups that might have been expected to be able to run ram-shot over things.
By the way, may I ask you, if you can remember, how was the Department of State notified about the proclamation of the re-establishment of Lithuania's independence? Was there any letter?
You mean, no, well, first, I mean, you mean in March of 90?
In March, yes.
Okay, well, first off, in March of 90, there were two officers from our consulate general in Leningrad, in Vilnius, who were reporting, I mean, slowly. There were also a large number of NATO diplomats from Iceland and Denmark who were sending word out, and it was being communicated. The events that were happening in Lithuania were on that day, as on many other days, communicated into the department first and foremost, not by official diplomatic channels, not even by the mass media, but by telephone calls and faxes that were communicated to the Lithuanian American community, to several members of Congress who were interested, and then those in turn were transferred over to people at the department. I was in 89, I was special assistant for Soviet nationalities in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and we were getting all kinds of stuff, not so much from American Embassy Moscow, because if something was reported by Kongen officers who were in Vilnius, they had to wait until they got back to St. Peter or to Leningrad, and then send it to Moscow, where it would become a cable and come in. Well, that meant they were 2 or 3 days behind events. The same thing was true in January of '91. That stuff was coming in real time by telephone, by fax. That the embassy was far behind. I mean, I
was just wondering if there is any like a common official procedure once any country.
Well, first off,
declares
I mean, declaring independence is an act that it depends what your status was, and it depends what the attitude of the place you're declaring yourself independence from. Essentially, the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians were saying that they were no longer occupied. They were now in a position to act as they had been between 1920 and 1940. That's a very different situation than, let's say, Nigeria or Hong Kong or South Africa. I mean, those are places that were leaving an empire. It was all based, and whenever anybody from the 3 Baltic capitals forgot that it was all about 1920, 1940, they were reminded with some vigor by the Baltic representatives in the West and by people like me, who pointed out that the minute you stop talking about 1920, 1940 is the minute you get dropped into the same box as Ukraine or Armenia or Uzbekistan. You do not want that to happen, because if that happens, you will never get into Europe.
And who was talking about that? These countries were independent, and they were forcefully.
Well, first off, there were people in the government who believed that profoundly, including your humble servant. There were people in Capitol Hill who cared a lot. The 6 people in the Senate who got purged because of the savings and loan scandal, mostly, they were all big-time supporters. But what really mattered, I think, more than anything, were 2 groups of people. One was the 3 Baltic representatives in the United States, to say Ernst Jaksin of Estonia, Dr. Dinbergs of Latvia, and Stasys Lozoraitis of Lithuania. Lozoraitis played the least role, in fact, because he wasn't there. I mean, he was in Rome, and he came to Washington. I mean, trying to get him to come to Washington on a permanent basis was hard, and it was also hard to get Jaksin, who lived in New York City, because he was Kongen for the United Nations, and also locum tenens in Washington. He didn't want to move either. Okay. But the 3 of them played a big role. Also, the Lithuanian American community. I mean, the National Day festivities in February were always a big thing, and people got it right. I mean, thanks largely to Huff's book on non-recognition policy, I think everybody understood exactly what was at stake. And so people got it right. And I attended a lot of those things, and I'm telling you, there were American officials who didn't get it right on occasion, but the ethnic community and a lot of people on Capitol Hill were carrying water on this in a good way, always. They knew what was at stake. Some of us had spent a lot of time briefing them that it did matter. And you'd be surprised that some of the people who probably mattered the most because of their powerful positions weren't necessarily the ones who got the most notice. I mean, someone who played a very big role behind the scenes, but chose for all kinds of reasons not to flaunt it, was Edward Kennedy. Because, of course, there's a large Lithuanian community in Massachusetts, and the history of non-recognition policy starts with the issue of being able to vote for or against Henry Cabot Lodge for the Senate in 22. And I have a letter from Teddy Kennedy downstairs thanking me for coming and going over all this with him. And I know that he was in a position to pick up the phone and talk to people that I could never reach to make the case. There were also a bunch of congressmen from Chicago. There were academics at the University of Wisconsin. What was interesting is that because nothing was official. There were the three heads of mission, but they were viewed by a lot of people as sort of curiosities, survivors from a distant past. And while people showed them respect, some of them didn't. I mean, I resigned at one point, as it happens, from the U.S. Baltic Foundation because these turkeys decided that it would be a clever thing to give an award to all the Baltic desk officers at the State Department. And I said, I'm not willing to stand up with some of those people and receive any recognition with them, because I know some of the things they said to these people, which are highly offensive. It's suggesting that they give up this nonsense about achieving independence.
So was it basically the same as it was after World War I? Just having too many of the small nations is
No.
Some large Russia or something?
No, there were the people who were running policy didn't know enough history of the period between 1918 and 1930 to be able to make that kind of reference. The problem was this. There was a view, and it was very widely held, including by the President and the Secretary of State, but not by the Secretary of Defense, and not by the Vice President, and not by a number of us at State, that if the Soviet Union came apart, it would be Yugoslavia, but it would be Yugoslavia with nuclear weapons. James Baker actually gave a speech in which he referred to the end of the Soviet Union as Yugoslavia with nukes. Direct quote. Well, one hopes very much that you've never had to be exposed to just how horrific these weapons are. But they're awful enough that once you've been exposed to that kind of information, it focuses the mind and you're prepared to sacrifice almost anything in order for that not to happen. And the fact that Jim Baker and George Bush were saying it's Yugoslavia with nukes was enough for them to oppose anything. There was a view that if the Balts got if the Balts got out, it would destabilize the whole place, which of course was going to happen. Their problem was they thought Gorbachev could save everything, in which case he lost everything. But that's the way things work. I still believe this, that had the United States gone to Gorbachev and said, you can't save everything, But if you get rid of the Balts, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, get rid of them, we're prepared to support you holding together the rest of it. And the fact is that until January of '90, that was real. That was possible. There was no reason. Were there people in all of these republics who would like to be independent because it's fun to have your own country? Sure. There weren't majorities in any of the republics, including Ukraine and Armenia, for independence before January of 1990. When Gorbachev sent the troops into Baku, that was it. It was over. All you had to do now was figure out what you were going to tell the children, because the Soviet Union was toast. The world changed. And it was my argument, I made it frequently when I was in INR, that if the Soviets tried to keep holding the Baltic countries, there would come a point when holding the Baltic countries would mean that you had the people who were committed to being independent inside the tent looking for allies, rather than being outside the tent and you could get rid of them. And that it should be our policy, since the government, President Bush, wanted stability and no change, that we should be in favor of getting the Baltic countries out, and we should go to the Soviets and make that argument. Now, that was no longer possible on January 22nd, 1990. But before that it was, and we could have, look, there have been Soviet leaders who wanted to get rid of the Balts. You know, Lavrentiy Pavlovich Beria in 1947 had a plan for letting the Balts be people's democracies. He went so far, believe it or not, as to compile who would be in the governments of a people's democracy of Estonia, people's democracy of Latvia, and people's democracy of Lithuania. They would be run a la like Poland or Czechoslovakia or whatnot, but they would be independent again. And that this was going to be part of a grand deal with the West for unity of Germany, neutralization of Germany, and no NATO. So it wasn't like there weren't people in Moscow who were thinking that the Balts are the real problem, and that they were thinking what to do with them. The problem was that in the United States, the people who were in positions of power didn't know enough about the distinction between the Balts and everyone else. They wanted to look at the Balts as if they were Uzbeks, which was a terrible thing to do.
Yeah,
not because...
I still don't get it. Why there was such a widely spread get out again? You know, like one of the...
Something profoundly to be wished, but never mind. We'd be better off.
Well, so people are...
Okay. No, but the point is... Look, the problem is, and this is what Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians have never understood either. Americans are an immigrant society. We were created by people who came from somewhere else and bought into an idea that was different than land and blood as the basis of identity. And immigrant societies are unlike all other societies which are based on other kinds of identities. So an immigrant society is a different thing than the Soviet Union was. And Americans, unfortunately, because Americans, like most people, are not too swift, project their own understanding of our identity onto others. To ask, how would we react if Texas left, is already to act as if this is Ukraine and Texas are equivalents. They're not. A better issue would have been if the United States had been trying to hold on to the Philippines 100 years, where we actually occupied them and then they wanted out. But Americans, like most people, project their own experience on the rest of the world, and they mostly get it wrong because the rest of the world isn't like them. One of the reasons that for all that's wrong with the Europeans in dealing with the Baltic countries, they got it less wrong than we did is because they weren't immigrant societies. And therefore they could understand what it meant to be occupied, because a lot of them had been occupied on occasion. Americans are different. We're an immigrant society and we've never been occupied. And that matters because we don't have on our own skin the experience of that would allow us to understand a Landsbergis. We just don't. And those of us who've spent our lives or wasted them trying to understand these other people have learned some of those things. But how many people do you think there are like that? I mean, in the summer of 1989, when I was special assistant for Soviet nationalities in INR, I was asked by the powers that be to survey the entire US government and find out how many experts there were on the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union. We're talking 150 million people, right? Large swaths of our chief geopolitical enemy. So I checked with Langley and Meade and the Pentagon and other places, and guess what? In June of 1989, about 2 years before it all comes apart, the United States government had working full-time on the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union, including the Balts, a grand total of one person, me. Now, I'm good, but nobody's that good, okay?
What brought you there? Why did you choose that?
Well, first off, like most things in life, it was a series of accidents, happy or not. I went to the University of Chicago for grad school, expecting to become a professor of political philosophy. For various reasons, that wasn't going to work. Ended up studying the non-Russian peoples because that's where most of the people of my generation who study non-Russians were trained. I went to join the Central Intelligence Agency, where, because I had a very deep interest in the first Russian immigration, I got to know people who cared about that sort of thing. And what happened was that when President Reagan gave his Guildhall speech and referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire, Richard Pipes of Harvard, who was down at the NSC as the chief Soviet hand at the time, wanted a public face of our view that the Soviet Union was an empire, not a country. And so you can't have a public face on a policy by having a person an official at the Central Intelligence Agency. You got to do it somewhere more public than that. So a decision was made to create these. There were 2 slots created in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and I was given one of them and wrote something over a period of 4 or 5 years, 20 or so Soviet nationality surveys that we tried to communicate to people that this is not one country, but at least 15, or in my view, more like 30. And it was a series of happy accidents. My intellectual training, such as it isn't on Baltic things at all. It's on the North Caucasus. I studied under a man who was from the Sorbonne, who was probably the world's greatest authority on Dagestan. As he was fabulous, Alex Bennigsen. But when I got into INR, I couldn't, as a U.S. official, stand up and say the Avars should be independent. But guess what? I could say that about the Lithuanians, the Latvians, and the Estonians. And so I used that as leverage, because if you could talk about one part of it having the right to be independent, soon you would get people to think that, well, if Estonians can be independent, how come not Ukrainians, and so on. And so I pushed very, very hard for Baltic independence as a Soviet nationality specialist at INR, because I saw that as a way of opening up the field and getting people to pay attention. I learned a lot about the Baltic peoples, but it is indicative that while I know a number of the non-Russian languages of the former Soviet space, they do not include the 3 Baltic languages. They're too hard. Even Latvian's too hard. And I know what you Lithuanians say about
Just
Latvian.
Estonian, only Estonian.
Oh no, Estonian is an impossible language. The Mormons who were missionaries in Estonia after 91 said there are only 2 categories of people on earth who can learn Estonian: baby Estonians and Mormons. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Now, if you could please define these words, what President Reagan said, an empire of evil, to the viewer who might just think, so what was wrong with the Soviet Union? Why did they want to break?
No. First off, Reagan's genius was to call it the evil empire. There are lots of empires in the world, but not all of them are evil, or not evil at least as the Soviet was. Please remember that the United States was primarily anti-communist rather than anti-Russian. The United States was not in the business at an official level of breaking apart the Soviet Union. Yes, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which had been illegally occupied in 1940 and then again in 44, 45, that was different. But that's less than 3% of the total area, the total population. So that's marginal. The United States was not committed to its dismemberment. What it was committed to was ending communism. And the fact that the non-Russians were oppressed gave us allies. It gave us people on the ground who were against communism because they were against Russians, because Russians and communists, for a lot of people, were not different species, but rather different names you called the same problem, okay? One must understand, George Bush came from a silver spoon in the mouth background of wealth and privilege in this country. I think a lot of his response to Yeltsin and Gorbachev was driven by that rather than by anything else. I think Bush 1 viewed Gorbachev as the scholarship kid at Yale, and he viewed Boris Yeltsin as the football player at Ohio State. And being himself a Yalie, he looked down his nose at people like Boris Yeltsin. Those who were on the other side of this political divide, and there were, including the Vice President, Dan Quayle, including the Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, didn't have the same view. But we were not committed to the destruction of the Soviet Union. What Bush wanted, he's been very clear about this actually, was a weakened Soviet Union. They didn't understand, and it wasn't that they weren't told. I'm very proud, I don't know if you've seen it, Asta, but Eric Rubin did an article about his time at the department, now that he's head of the American Foreign Service Association. He says, it's not true no one in the Department of State said the place was coming apart. He said, we were told in terms in 1989 that the Balts would be independent within 2 years and the rest of them would follow by your humble servant. That's in the current issue of the American Foreign Service Association Journal. I'm very proud of that because it's nice when somebody else says it so you don't have to just keep saying it yourself. I didn't matter very much, but I did make it harder for the people who wanted to betray everything. And there were people who did. There are people who would have been thrilled if the Balts had just gone away. The Baltic problem went away because it was getting in the way of our dealing with Gorbachev. Seriously. we shouldn't be surprised. It is like that in 1914, there were four big empires in Europe, or on the edges of Europe: the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Russian. The other three disintegrated during the war. The fourth one was saved by the brilliant statecraft, and it was brilliant, of Vladimir Lenin, who understood that the only way to save the empire was to say you weren't doing it, that you were creating a state of a new kind. The others were not clever enough to do that, and so they lost it all. Putin is violating the very, very first rule of how to save that empire. He's being overly pro-Russian. Lenin understood that the Russians were the problem, that if you gave the Russians their head, everyone would leave. I mean, everyone would leave. And so Lenin sat on the Russians. Putin is celebrating them. This is a very good strategy from the point of view of people like me. It's not an especially good strategy from the point of view of people like Putin, but it's exactly what he's doing. And he's being encouraged by idiots in this country who don't understand that they're destroying the very foundation of a policy world that they think they want. I want Eurasia not to be all pink and under the rule of the Muscovites. And I think we're going to see it, because the Russians, as people have understood for several hundred years, are incapable of doing just enough. They always try to do too much. And the only reason that Vladimir Putin looks like a success right now is that we have probably the most incompetent group of leaders in the West that we have ever had since 1938. I mean, these people make some of the people who led Britain and France in the late 30s look like geopolitical geniuses. These people are fools. The good news is they won't be in office forever. That's the good news. The bad news is a lot of people are going to suffer unnecessarily because they're in power now.
Because
it's not a
it's
country.
still Russia.
No, it's not. That's the point. Look, there was never, before 1917, it was never a Russian nation state. There was no census where people were ever asked to define their nationality. There was no statement that this is Ruskaya. It was Rossiyskaya, which is a different thing altogether. This is membership in a state. When Lenin and Stalin drew the borders, they drew the borders of Ukraine and Armenia and Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan. And what was left, they called the Russian Federation, the RSFSR. There is no Russian state. There is no single Russian identity. Both of those things are myths. The fact that they are widely believed by people who call themselves experts on this part of the world is too bad, but it doesn't make them true. This is simply not the case. The Russian identity is weaker than Ukrainian identity, not to speak of places like Lithuania. I mean, you had the Catholic Church besides everything else, which is the reason the Russians hate you so much. They hate the Estonians because the Estonians make no secret of how much they hate the Russians. They hate you because you're viewed as crypto-Poles, because you're Catholics. And we all know that Catholicism is the great enemy of the real true faith of Russian Orthodoxy. They know they can cut deals with the Latvians because the Latvians are only too willing to cut deals with them. This is what's really amazing to me is you ask the things you can't see. 40 years in this business on, I still don't quite understand why it is that the Latvians have the bad reputation for being the most anti-Russian, and they're the least anti-Russian of the three Baltic groups. I mean, it's just totally, I don't quite get it. The Latvians are very bad at public relations. The The Lithuanians and the Estonians are very much better. Very much better.
Now, nationalities in the United States.
Okay.
Like
Ethnicities.
each diaspora mobilizes and starts.
Well, some do and some don't. It depends. I mean, some people are members of ethnic groups that have never mobilized.
Yeah, but mostly they do when there's some trouble in the old
Well,
country.
you'd be surprised. I mean, my background is German and English, and we didn't do too much when we were mistreated during the First War, or when the Irish became problems for the British Empire. I mean, it's just a historical fact that some diasporas mobilize and some don't. I mean, the Armenians and the Jews are the classic examples. Others approach those two, but those are the. I mean, I love the Armenians. I mean, there's just they used to have a newspaper in this country called the Armenian Reporter, and its masthead said, "All the news about Armenians, all the news that's important," and they assumed that those two things were identical. I still have downstairs somewhere an article clip from that about they did an interview with a Armenian woman who was a stripper, and she wouldn't give her name because of what she was pursuing as a career. But I'll never forget the last paragraph of this article. It said, "Even in this unusual career, Armenians are outstanding." No, but in this country, sometimes groups mobilize and sometimes they don't. And a lot of it happens depending on how concentrated they are, how much influence they can have. A group in a small state often matters more than a group in a big state. The Lithuanians mattered a whole lot more in Chicago and in Massachusetts than anywhere else because they defined those as the places they were critical. Whereas those that are smaller or in bigger states may not have the option. And it also depends what the attitude of the home country is. I mean, some home countries, you left, you're no longer part of us. That's not true, I think, in the Baltic countries, but it's true of a lot of places that, people who left have left the sinking ship or something, and there's a lot of criticism. And the other thing is that when diaspora populations are able to go home, as it were, and play a role, they often find themselves not very well liked. For one reason, they think they have answers and should be listened to in ways that the people of those countries figure it's not your place to say that. And I said, written, that one of the big tasks in 92, 91, end of 91, beginning of 92, was to transform the Baltic issue from an ethnic issue to being a state-to-state issue. In other words, what mattered after September 2nd was that we, the United States, had relations with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. That's different than dealing through the diaspora populations. That's the diaspora's relationship is suddenly got very big change. I mean, one of the issues that you may be focusing on was the fight over whether the first ambassadors to these countries would be ethnic Americans from those communities. And what happened was that the only senior member of the senior foreign service who was a Balt was a Latvian, and he got Latvia. He got the ambassadorship in Silic. It was a disaster, but not because he's a bad man, but because it was an impossible position. He didn't want to appear to have gone native, so he understated what he saw, and everyone in Washington understated what he said because they thought he must have gone native. So it's not a good thing. In Lithuania, the decision was that, well, Lithuania is between Poland and Russia, so let's get a senior official, a senior foreign service officer who's served in both Warsaw and Moscow. Well, there are lots of those, actually. And in fact, that's who we got. We got the DCM in Warsaw, went to Vilnius. The question was then, would the Estonians get an ethnic Estonian? Well, an ethnic Estonian did try to buy his way into it. And that prompted the White House to announce that there would be no political ambassadors in the Baltic countries because there was a great fear that that would have made life impossible at Vilnius, because why wasn't there a Lithuanian American there? And so, believe it or not, the decision on who was the first American ambassador in Tallinn was made because the guy who was the NSC specialist on Eritrea happened to be meeting with Larry Eagleburger right after Larry had been told we need to find an ambassador to Tallinn. And so he asked the guy, "What are you doing after you fixed Eritrea?" The guy says, "I don't know. I'm looking for work." So, "Would you like to be ambassador to Tallinn?" And that's how it happened. I mean, this is, and he was the best American ambassador in the three Baltic countries we've ever had, by a lot, by a whole bunch. But he was, because he was smart, tough-minded, and I think the fact that he dealt with the Ethiopians helped, actually. But unfortunately, he died in Yugoslavia because Strobe Talbot didn't get his plane landing rights, and he went over the mountain in a car, and the car went off the mountain, and he was killed in an automobile accident. Some of us blame Strobe Talbot for that, among other things. Anyway.
Yeah, so I think we have touched it. What else about the 90s, 91? Yeah, actually we have touched it a little bit, but yes, how was this interaction with the Lithuanian community? Were there any trouble with variety of the rules of the Lithuanians?
Well, we have. Well, we all.
Coordination or something. Were there?
Well, okay. There are lots of things one can say. I mean, on balance, the Lithuanian Americans were much more useful than not. But there were moments, okay? One was, of course, rooted into the system when the Estonians decided to make JBank, the Joint Baltic American National Committee, an Estonian special operation. And the way they did that was by getting the Latvian American community on board, but then choosing the wrong LAC. They chose the Lithuanian American Council, which consists of a couple dozen people in Chicago who are social democrats, old and out of step and don't have much political influence, rather than the Lithuanian American community, which is rooted in the Catholic parishes and had thousands of people who could be mobilized. And so JBank was made irrelevant, but the difference between the LAC and the LAC mattered. The most important thing is that the Lithuanian American community, in the good offices of Ostap and Jonas in particular, played a key role in providing the flow of information between Vilnius and official Washington. We couldn't have done as well as we did without the help of the Lithuanian American community. This took all kinds of neat forms. The most wonderful was when the killings in Vilnius happened. Gorbachev's people shut down communication between Lithuania and the outside world. This led to the formation of the ham radio operator bridge between Lithuania and the United States. And in the morning, Washington time, they would communicate with the people in Massachusetts and Maine. Then later in the day, the people in Chicago, and the end of the day in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And that stuff, which of course came in Lithuanian, was communicated to Asta, and Asta then communicated it to us. And I made sure I was doing, at that point, something called the Baltic Situation Report, which was issued several times a day, sometimes, that went to all senior officials. And so we were beating the hell out of the basic intelligence and diplomatic communications product because we were getting the information that way. And people...
That makes me wonder, if there is a State Department, aren't they supposed to have their own information?
No, but you see, no, but...
rather than relying on an ethnic community.
No, it's real simple. No one would have done this if there'd been an American embassy in Vilnius. But we didn't have an embassy in Vilnius. We didn't really have a Lithuanian mission in Washington because the head of it wasn't there all the time and didn't have staff and there was a lot he couldn't do. So clearly it was important that we get any source of information we could. As soon as we opened an embassy in Vilnius, everything changed. No one at the department would have been willing to use Lithuanian Americans the way they were used before the end of September '91, after that time, because it wouldn't have been appropriate. But when we were in a situation where things were happening, the Balts were playing a key role, not just Lithuania, all three, in providing us with information that we couldn't have gotten any other way. And I'll give you an example. This is not Lithuanian, but it tells you how important a role the Balts played. At the time of the coup in Moscow, in August 19th, 20th, 21st, 91, the United States had no diplomatic presence in the 11 non-Russian republics, or the 3 Baltic states. What we did have, however, was remarkable contacts through Tallinn with the Lithuanian or the Estonian president. And he was on the phone with all of the party leaders in all of those places to find out what was going on in Tbilisi and Tashkent and Ashgabat. The only person he couldn't reach was the first secretary of Azerbaijan, who was on vacation in Iran. But we were getting information that way, and it went from President Arnold Rutel to his foreign minister, Leonard Merry, who became president, who then sent it to me, and I distributed it through both American channels and NATO channels. We were beating the hell out of the intelligence community and whatnot because we had a channel of information that was golden. That's golden. You don't do that except under extraordinary circumstances. Now, the Lithuanian American, when I was doing Baltic things at state, every day I would make 6 phone calls. My day started with 6 phone calls. The first 3 were to the heads of mission, of the Baltic missions in the United States, or when he was in Rome, to Lazaridis in Rome. The next 3 were the heads of the Washington offices of the Baltic American communities. Asta for the Lithuanians, Ojars Kalniņš and Martin Svaners for the Latvians, and Estonians, I'm sorry? Marianne. Yes, my good friend, Marianne Ricken. The United States would not have been able to pursue the positive things it did manage to pursue in '91 without the constant help of the Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian diasporas and their organizations. It was absolutely essential. Had we not had their help, and I can tell you, had we not had their help both in January, especially with Lithuania and Latvia, and then again in August, thanks to this Estonian telephone lash-up, the United States would have been in a much worse position, and things might have gone really, really wrong. Fortunately, they didn't. I'm very proud that several years ago, I had plaques made for all of the people in Lithuania who were part of the ham radio operators thing, and there's one of those that's been put up in the TV tower. I'm happy to say. Fortunately, they didn't. I'm very proud that several years ago, I had plaques made for all of the people in Lithuania who were part of the ham radio operators thing, and there's one of those that's been put up in the TV tower, I'm happy to say, because they were made right out here at Stanton, plaques and memorials, because I think that when the history of this mess is written, that the people who really mattered, the people who made things happen, are not going to be necessarily the big names, as important as they are, but rather a lot of people who finally said, we've had enough. We just want to be free, and we will do what we can, and we'll make a difference, and they did. And I want those people remembered. Those people on the ground in the Baltic countries, and Americans of Baltic descent, and the large number of Americans not of Baltic descent who were sympathetic and supportive. I don't think people in Lithuania to this day understand how much support there was among ordinary Americans. The reason the Bush people were so frightened by the press coverage was because they knew that what Bush was getting wrong in Vilnius and Riga and Tallinn was hurting them with the average Americans. I was at the receiving end of a lot of these people's feelings. And I can tell you that the average American was on the side of the Lithuanians at the TV tower, the Latvians in the green space, and the Estonians both in March and then again in August. On March 29th, 1991, one of my jobs was when non-Russian leaders came to the United States, I was to give them a tour of the city. There was no money for this, but I would load them up in my Volvo and I would drive them around to various things. The Kennedy grave, the Supreme Court, which incidentally, you should know, it was in front of the Supreme Court that people wanted to be photographed more than in front of the White House or in front of the Congress. And the reason is because what it says on the lintel, equal justice under law. And for Balts and for the other non-Russians, that was critical. But on this day, this Saturday, March the 29th, rainy, cold, miserable day, I was driving around the president and foreign minister of Estonia. And my goal in doing these tours was always to end up at the Lincoln Memorial, because that's the closest thing we Americans have to a secular cathedral. It's our Gediminas statue. Okay. We're in the Lincoln Memorial, and the only common language I have with these people is Russian. So I'm translating the Gettysburg Address into Russian, butchering it, no doubt, but doing the best I could, right? Like the woman who'd never played an organ before said. And this National Park Ranger, the guys with the little hats, comes running up, and he says, "What language are you speaking?" I said, "We're speaking Russian." He's got a folder for that. He says, "Are these people from Russia?" And I said, "No." I said, "These people are from Estonia." Without missing a beat, this unknown National Park Ranger said the most important words any American said to a Balt in 1991. He said, "I've heard of Estonia." It's just a little country that wants to be free. That was the American attitude. It wasn't the attitude of the government, which was concerned about alliances in the Middle East, and arms control. But it was what the average American thought. Why should these people be shot because all they want is to be free? And as important as the diasporas were, they would not have succeeded in playing the role that they did, except that they were within an American population that was overwhelmingly pro-Balt. One of the things which, in my view, the Baltic governments have not understood and not acted on in ways that they should, is to recognize that what happened, the support that ultimately came their way from the United States, came not just because of the diasporas, although that matters profoundly, but because for the average American, people couldn't understand why we weren't on the side of the people rather than the police. And that's an amazing, that's something that makes me proud of being an American beyond measure. It's something which I wish Baltic leaders had spoken to more often than they did, because they would have been able to build more support in the United States and on the Hill than they have since 91. That's my view. The thing is, everyone played a role. Parceling out who did more or less is probably a big mistake, because it will only lead to fights and anger that no one needs, okay? But clearly, the Lithuanians are more aware than the others of the strength of the Lithuanian diaspora because there's so many of them. And although it has surprised me, I have to say that a lot of Lithuanian Americans don't really understand the role they played in 1922 and 1940. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people, as Asa can tell you, at various groups about that, and it always amazes me that people don't know the stories, because they're wonderful stories. I mean, the story of how I used to tell the Balts in early 1991, don't complain that we haven't recognized you yet. After all, we waited 5 years the last time. I said, you got a U.S. senator who's up for election, you can help? First off, look, the U.S. non-recognition policy with respect to the Baltics grew out of a statement made by the Secretary of State under Herbert Hoover in 1930 and became known as the Stimson Doctrine. Henry Stimson was Secretary of State to Herbert Hoover. When the Japanese invaded China, northern China, and they occupied Manchuria, they occupied it, and then they transformed Manchuria into a puppet state called Manchukuo. The United States did not want to recognize that because it would have had the effect of rewarding aggression, for one thing, although we do that on occasion, but rather because they didn't want to weaken China. Stimson came up with the doctrine that the United States will never recognize the creation of a state by violence alone. All those words matter. The United States won't recognize a state created by violence alone. In other words, the United States was not going to be willing to recognize Manchukuo unless there was an international consortium or negotiation or peace conference or something that said that's okay. Okay. When the Soviet government, acting on the basis of Molotov-Ribbentrop, occupied the Baltic countries and then annexed them, The important player in 1940 is not Sumner Welles. The important player is a man named Loy Henderson, after whom the State Department auditorium is named. Loy Henderson today would have had the position of sort of head of policy planning. Loy Henderson wrote a memo to the secretary that said, given the Stimson doctrine that we don't recognize the creation of, of a new state or change of territory by violence alone, how can we recognize what the Soviets have just done, even though at that point the Soviets are not our enemy, when we haven't recognized what Japan has done in Manchuria? That went to Sumner Welles. It had two consequences. The first was that Welles was not very comfortable about that, because taking a position about the bloody Russians is different than taking a position about the bloody Japanese. I mean, the United States was quite willing to drop nuclear weapons on Japan. It would not have been willing to do it on a European country. Regrettably, it's just fact, okay? But the other consequence was, this is the part that gets missed in all of the discussions of 1940. The United States will not recognize any territorial change achieved by force alone. The word alone is the key word here. The United States expected that at the end of World War II, there would be a peace conference, as there had been in Versailles after World War I, and that at that peace conference, people would sit down and draw lines. And that then the United States would have been in a position to recognize the absorption of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania if it had been confirmed by a peace conference, because that would have been the additional action beyond military violence. It's why, when they set up non-recognition policy, they assumed that there was plenty of money. Even the Lithuanians, who had most of their money in gold, which was a mistake because the United States, for reasons God alone knows, treated gold as a sovereign asset that couldn't be sold off. You had to have demand deposits, stocks, and bonds. Those could be used and were, but Lithuanians ran out of those before anyone else did. The Estonians had relatively little gold, and Latvians only a little bit more, but the Lithuanians had all this gold, which ultimately worked to their benefit, but it wasn't the way. But the assumption was the war will be over in five or 6 years, and then we'll have a peace conference, and then this will be solved. So it's the Stimson doctrine that did this. Now, why? Sumner Welles was Secretary of State, so he gets the billboard. But in fact, the ideas came from Loy Henderson, and they're all based on the Stimson doctrine of 1930. However, Stimson would not have gone ahead had it not been for a visit by the Lithuanian American community to the White House, pointing out that 1940 was a year divisible by 4, and that Franklin Roosevelt was running for a third term, something nobody had ever done before, and that he needed every vote he could get, and the Lithuanians wouldn't vote for him if he recognized Soviet occupation. And it was at that point that the White House and the State Department got together and issued the Welles Declaration. But it's a mistake to see this as an innovation of 1940, and especially to see it as an innovation of Sumner Welles. It was the Stimson doctrine, which was settled American policy in 1930. And I think there are too many people who've written or talked about non-recognition policy who've never heard of the Stimson doctrine and don't understand that that was what made it possible for the Americans to do what the Americans did. Had the Japanese not occupied Manchuria and declared Manchu Kuo, the United States would never have adopted a non-recognition policy for Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It's rooted in Manchuria.
Was there